A few months ago, I uploaded a video that was made famous by Saffron Olive where I played Mono Red Living End.
Carry Zeb's expertise into tormenting voice.
The deck used very cheap discard outlets to put creatures into our graveyard, and then a Karizev's expertise to reanimate them all with Living End. And Ravnica Allegiances brought the Mono Red Living End a brand new toy in Electrodominance. My name's Dan, this is MTG Tavern, and this deck is something I'm rather inventively calling Mono Red Living End 2.0. When Electrodominance was announced earlier this month to be printed in Ravnica Allegiances, I felt two different emotions. I felt great joy because it's a brand new toy for Living End, whilst also feeling great sorrow because, damn it Wizards, I should have had that preview card. That has my name written all over it. Not literally, the word Daniel isn't in there. But putting aside all bitter feelings towards Wizards and my lack of a preview card, Electrodominance is something that Mono Red Living End desperately needed. The key thing is the fact that it's an instant. Currently we're relying on sorcery speed Karizev's expertise or a Goblin Dark Dwellers. The fact it essentially only costs 2 red mana is also quite a big deal. In a deck that doesn't want to run too many lands, asking for 3 or 5 mana for Karizev's or Goblin Dark Dwellers is actually quite a big ask. Now the original build of Mono Red Living End did run Hollow Ones. Unfortunately, Hollow One has become quite a bad deck in the format. It sounds really stupid saying this, but it's actually too slow and inconsistent. And the same can be said for Mono Red Living End. The Hollow Ones were incredibly inconsistent, and they had to be taken out of the deck. I tried to make the deck more consistent with more looting effects, more burn spells, more creatures to cycle. The problem was that as much as we tried to find our Electrodominance, we never really found both Electrodominance and Living End in the same hand. And when we did, it was way too late. So I finally had to bite the bullet and accept I had to splash a second colour. So now let me reintroduce you to a now rebranded Mono Red Splashing Black Living End. Doesn't quite have the same ring. We begin our deck tech with the cycling creatures. We're running 4 Desert Ceradons, 4 Street Wraiths, and because of our splash of black, we have 2 Archfiends of Ifnir and 3 Horror of the Broken Lands. Now, although Archfiend of Ifnir sure is a black CMC spell, it is too colourless to cycle it into our graveyard. And sure, we do have to pay 1 black mana to cycle the Horror of the Broken Lands, but in all reality we're still quite happy just discarding that to a Faithless Looting or a Cathartic Reunion. These are probably the best 2 creatures in a regular Living End build. The Archfiend of Ifnir can bitch slap your opponent's entire team, the Horror of the Broken Lands can single-handedly win a game if you discard enough cards. And although I would have liked to have built a Mono Red Living End deck without these 2 cards, if we're splashing black, we may as well put these cards in as well. The remainder of our creatures offer more utility than cycling ability. The one of Urabrask can come back and give our creatures haste, which means that if we do have to use a Karizev's expertise, we're more than capable of winning the game straight away. The Stick Monkeys are there to produce extra mana in the early part of the game. We can't be running too many lands in this deck because we do need to find our combo pretty quickly, and the fact we can use a Simian Spirit Guide rather than a land at times is actually quite helpful. A one-off Ferromacabre is there to exile cards from our opponent's graveyard when we want to Living End. And finally, the Insolent Nenates offer us a little bit of everything. They give us a creature on turn when we can maybe get in for a couple of chip points of damage. It can be a blocker, but most importantly, it's something we can discard and draw a brand new card. It's also something we get back with the Living End later in the game. Moving on to the spell package, we start with Electrodominance, the card that everyone who loves Living End is very excited about from the new set. We pay 2 mana and we don't have to pay anything for X. We can then at instant speed cast our Living End and reanimate all of our creatures. We're only playing 3 Electrodominance and 2 Karizev's expertise. We only need to find 1 of these, and I think with the amount of card draw we have, this should be fine. Speaking of Living End, we're running a 2 of Living End. We will get to why we're only running 2 later on in this deck tech. We're also running 2 Wheel of Fates because we want to give it a trial. The fact we can maybe discard a whole bunch of creatures and draw 7 brand new cards could be fantastic for us. Our other enabler for Living End is the Karizev's Expertise. It's stuck around from the last Living End deck. We've lost the Goblin Dark Dwellers. Whilst Karizev's Expertise is a much worse card than Electrodominance, it does offer us an alternative way of casting our Living End should our opponents somehow get rid of our Electrodominances. Now you may be asking, why are we realistically splashing black? After all, Horror of the Broken Lands isn't really worth splashing black for, and Archfiend of Ifnir is pretty much colourless. You may also be asking, why only 2 Living Ends? Well, the answer simply is Mausoleum Secrets. Printed in Guilds of Ravnica, Mausoleum Secrets, even with no creatures in our graveyard, allows us at instant speed to search for a 0 CMC spell, and as we all know, Living End has no converted mana cost. Now your question may be, well, why not just run more Living Ends? How about we draw the actual Living End rather than the Mausoleum Secrets? Well, the simple answer is, it doesn't always have to tutor a Living End. Maybe our opponent has a big fat creature we're really scared of, let's just say a Gristlebrand, in their graveyard. Well, in that case, I would much rather fetch myself a Fairy Macabre over a Living End and hopefully find a Living End later on. Maybe our opponent has a whole bunch of small creatures in their graveyard and we need to make sure we can get an Archfiend of Ifnir into our graveyard before we can cast our Living End. We can then tutor the Archfiend of Ifnir, cycle it into our graveyard, and Electrodominance plus Living End to combo off. So while Mausoleum Secrets is there to tutor our Living Ends usually, it does allow us a toolbox strategy of finding a piece we need to get ourselves out of a situation that may arise. Our other non-creature spells are 4 Faithless Lootings, by far the best discard draw card outlet in Modern, 2 Cathartic Reunions, and a Tormenting Voice. We're also running 4 Lightning Bolts because I hear damage to the face is quite good. Our mana base is chock full of fetch lands. We want to get as many lands out of our library as we possibly can. We're running 4 Bloodstained Mires and 3 Wooded Foothills. We can quite easily splash black through a couple of Blood Crypts and a one-off Swamp just in case there are any Blood Moons around. We're running 6 Mountains and finally a one-off Forbidden Orchard which can tap for black or red, but most importantly it can give our opponent a Spirit token which we can then target with a Karizev's Expertise. So if we're playing against a blue-based control deck or Tron, they don't play that many creatures that stick around. Our sideboard also lends quite a big hand to Mausoleum Secrets in the main. We have 2 Fatal Pushes. If we're against a creature aggro deck, we can cycle and then tutor a Fatal Push to kill something that's getting in the way. Maybe they have a Scavenging Ooze, a Meddling Mage, naming Living End. Fatal Push is going to help us get out of these situations. We also have 2 Surgical Extractions. Again, if we're against a graveyard deck, we can Mausoleum Secrets to fetch our Surgical Extraction and exile those horrible cards from their graveyard. We have 2 Guttural Responses for those annoying blue-based decks where we have to resolve our Living Ends, 2 Ingot Chewers to deal with artifacts we don't want to see, whilst also putting a creature into our graveyard, 2 Anger of the Gods to deal with those pesky creature aggro decks, and then finally 3 Young Pyromancers when we're expecting enchantment-based graveyard hate in the way of Leyline or Rest in Peace. We can switch up to a token aggro deck. And we also have 2 Eidolon of the Great Revel if we're playing against Storm, but again also if we're expecting a lot of graveyard hate, it's a creature we can put down and maybe sneak the game from our opponent. And that is Mono Red Living End Splashing Black 2.0. Now before we go away and see how the games went, let's check in as we always do with the streamers and see what they think of Mono Red Living End.
I don't know much about Mono Red Living End, honestly. I don't know much about the deck.
Do you think Mono Red Living End in Modern is good now that we have Electrodominance? Yes. It is actually going to be the next gameplay video. Spoilers for all you guys watching on YouTube, but Mono Red Living End is going to be coming up next Saturday. Next Monday.
Yeah, I don't know about Mono Red Living End.
Do I think Mono Red Living End in Modern is good now that you have Electrodominance? You're asking the wrong person.
I think the Joint Living End is better.
Living End in Modern is good now that we have Electrodominance. I do not play Modern, so I have no idea.
Do you think Mono Red Living End in Modern is good now we have Electrodominance? I think it's definitely better than it was before.
I saw the list originally and thought it was interesting. I don't know how good it is. I think it is definitely playable. Which is honestly more than I ever thought I would say about any sort of mono red combo deck.
Our opening hand is a thing of beauty. After all, it does have the Electrodominance and both the Living End and the Wheel of Fate. We're going to be manoeuvrable. We can go one way, we can go the other. But with the right top decks in the form of creatures, we could power out an absurd board state very fast. Think of this hand as Garruk wearing a ballerina's costume. Now the hand does pose us one other question. Why do so many images in Magic the Gathering depict people wearing robes? Also, that is the least circular wheel I have ever seen. Whether we go down the Wheel of Fate or the Living End route will depend on what our opponent is playing and what our top decks are like. Our opponent plays a Mountain and a Goblin Guide. I think instantly we can say our hand has turned from a rather attractive Garruk in a ballerina's costume to a Garruk with his face smashed in. Against the burn deck, I don't want to give them more cards in hand with a Wheel of Fate, and from the same token I don't want to lose life to a Street Wraith and a Wooded Foothills. The Goblin Guide attacks and we find ourselves a Horror of the Broken Lands. Now, that isn't too bad. We're going to be able to put that into our graveyard for our Living End, probably next turn. Our opponent plays a second Mountain and plays a second Goblin Guide, followed by a Boomak Courier. Now, if our opponent's going to be on an aggressive burn deck, this isn't the worst. At least they're playing out creatures, so we can remove the board next turn. Our opponent gets in, the first Goblin Guide reveals a Mausoleum Secrets. I fetch with the second Goblin Guide trigger on the stack, a tip for you youngsters out there, so that we can reveal a different card on top of our library in a second. I shock myself with the intent of cycling a Horror of the Broken Lands. We find a Lightning Bolt on top, we cycle the Horror of the Broken Lands and take 5 points of damage. I decided to not cycle the Street Wraith. Our opponent has 3 cards in hand, and as long as one of those is a land, we might be able to get there with the Horror of the Broken Lands. This deck does discard a lot of cards. I do go ahead and Electrodominance straight away. We cast the Living End, get back our Horror of the Broken Lands. Our opponent suspends a Rift Bolt, we draw a Lightning Bolt. We're in for 4 points of damage. I decide to leave it there. I don't want to reduce my life total below 10 at this point of the game. Our opponent Rift Bolts us, they play their third land, and we see Skewer the Cities, the new card from Ravnica Allegiances. Make that a second Skewer the Cities. 9 points of damage from 3 cards, not bad from our opponent. We almost certainly have to win next turn, so we're going to gamble with these Lightning Bolts and take our opponent down to 10. We need 3 Cyclers, none of which can be the Street Wraith. An Instant Eliminate is a pretty good start. We can discard a card and trigger our Horror of the Broken Lands to give it +2/+1. We get rid of the Street Wraith since we're never going to be able to cycle that anyway. We draw into a Faithless Looting. Fuck me, we actually got there. We discard 2 cards, 2 triggers on the Horror of the Broken Lands. Our opponent must be trying to figure out how the hell they lost this game. Their confusion must be equal to that of the average Jund player.
Oh, you're playing a budget deck, bloody marvellous. I of course spent $5,000 filling out my Jund deck. Oh, I lost again.
Sideboarding is rather simple. Street Wraith, something that loses us life against the burn deck, is instantly out, along with 1 Archfiend of Ifnir. In come the 2 Ingot Chewers I'm worried about ensnaring Bridges and potential Relic of Progenituses, and the 3 Young Pyromancers. Now in game 2 I'm feeling like a bit of a dumbass. Why is this Wheel of Fate still in my deck against burn? Other than that, our hand is pretty good. Our opponent begins with a turn 1 Goblin Guide yet again. The double G's reveals an Electrodominance off the top of our library. Now my full intention here is to go all in on this Wheel of Fate and hope our opponent is maybe stuck on 1 land or something like that, and hopefully the Wheel of Fate can help us out and draw us into a Living End combo. We have a good Urabrask in our hand. A Horror of the Broken Lands and a Young Pyromancer are not bad to get with a Living End. So this Wheel of Fate is all or nothing. If this goes horribly, I'm going to rage quit like a little bitch. Our opponent plays a Monastery Swiftspear and they follow it up with a Lava Spike. Now that would signal to me that my opponent probably has no more creatures in hand, and if this Wheel of Fate doesn't almost instantly get us into a Living End combo, the game is done. Our opponent gets in with the Goblin Guide. They reveal a Desert Ceridon on top. I decide to go ahead and fetch a Blood Crypt, but I'm going to play it tapped. I know we're going to Electrodominance next turn anyway. Draw into a Fairy Macabre. While being nice to put into our graveyard, it's not that useful right now. I go ahead and Electrodominance for the grand total of 0. We cast our Wheel of Fate. Come on, Living End combo. We draw a whole bunch of creatures. I rage quit like one of those 12-year-olds playing Call of Duty.
Exactly where I was, my fucking smoking him.
In sideboarding again, I can't get those Wheel of Fates out of my library quick enough. I bring in 2 Fatal Pushes which we can fetch with the Mausoleum Secrets. I'm hoping my opponent is kind of confused about what kind of deck we are by the Wheel of Fate, which we've now taken out. We keep a hand that is really good with the two young pyromancers. We have fatal pushes and lightning bolts for interaction, and a faithless looting to go with those young pyromancers will generate a lot of tokens. I go ahead and play the Bloodstained Mire first, and I really want to get a blood crit, but I don't want to take the life loss, so I'm going to do nothing this turn. The Goblin Guide gets in and reveals another Bloodstained Mire. Now that we've found our second Bloodstained Mire, I decide to go ahead and fetch a Swamp and get rid of the Goblin Guide. We've taken 1 damage in this early game. We find an Electrodominance on top. Truth be told, not really the card I want right now with Young Pyromancers in our hand. I want more 1-mana cantrips. Play out the Young Pyromancer, I'm fully expecting this to get bolted or generally removed. Our opponent plays a turn 2 Monastery Swiftspear. I do contemplate blocking here, but I think 1 point of damage isn't a big deal and we're going to be able to generate a lot of tokens next turn. We top deck the Mausoleum Secret, so we do actually have the Living End combo in our hand. Unfortunately, I don't really want to cast it. I fetch another basic mountain, and I play out the Young Pyromancer. We follow up with a Faithless Looting to generate 2 tokens. We find another Young Pyromancer and a Horror of the Broken Lands in our hand. I decide to get rid of the Mausoleum Secrets and the Horror of the Broken Lands. The Electrodominance can kind of act like a removal spell later on in the game. We get in with the Young Pyromancer for 2 points of damage. We're looking pretty good at this point of the game. Our opponent finds their second land, and they Searing Blaze our Young Pyromancer. Now that is a bit of a problem. We do want our Young Pyromancers, and we were hoping to get something better than just a Searing Blaze out of them. We take the 2 points of damage. We're still on a relatively healthy 12 points of damage, and we can start chump blocking soon with our tokens if need be. We draw another Faithless Looting off the top. That is very fortunate. We play out our Young Pyromancer 3.0, and we get in for 4 points of damage. Looks like the race really is on. I go ahead and Lightning Bolt the Monastery Swiftspear now to play around any potential prowess triggers. We get 2 more tokens, and I feel like we're really starting to pull ahead. Our opponent casts a second Monastery Swiftspear, and they follow up with a Lightning Bolt to take out one of our Young Pyromancers. That is a very, very good sign for us. That Young Pyromancer has essentially made our opponent discard a card and gained us 3 life. And the writing may be on the wall for our opponent when the Monastery Swiftspear does not attack us. We find a Simian Spirit Guide off the top. We discard Faithless Looting to generate another token. We find an Urabrask and a Tormenting Voice on top. We discard both of those. I swing in with all the team, including the Young Pyromancer. At this point, I'm feeling that far ahead that I'm quite happy to trade a Monastery Swiftspear for my Young Pyromancer. My opponent only blocks a token. We follow up with an Electrodominance using our Simian Spirit Guide to deal 1 point of damage to the Monastery Swiftspear and thus kill it. We generate another token, and I don't really see how outside of multiple bolts our opponent wins this game. Our opponent pays the full price for Skewer the Cities. Now that would lead me to believe they probably have more of those in their hand. We top deck a mountain and we decide to Faithless Looting. We don't really want that card. We draw a Desert Ceradon and a Bloodstained Mire. I decide to keep the basic mountain since it's not going to cost us any life and just get rid of the cards we drew. We get in for 5 points of damage with our tokens. Our opponent doesn't top deck anything of note and we win the game. Now in Game 2, I'm going to do a brief rundown of what's happened for 2 reasons. One is that I really like my opponent's deck and I want to build it myself. The other reason being that we need to try and cut some time. Some of these matches go a bit longer than I would have liked, so we're just going to briefly skip over this one. Our opening hand is saved by a Street Wraith and a Faithless Looting. We do have the Mausoleum Secrets and Wheel of Fate combo in our hand, but unfortunately, it is foiled by an Inquisition of Kozilek. Our opponent goes on to cast a Liliana's Caress on turn 2, and yeah, at this point I feel like a goat next to a lion. A Cathartic Reunion and 2 Burning Inquiries later, and yeah, we're dead. After sideboarding, our opponent goes into the Arc-like Phoenix plan. Now, I did sideboard in the Surgical Extractions because I was kind of expecting this. Ever since Arc-like Phoenix came into the format, people do have these transformational sideboards, and it's kind of not that surprising anymore. Unfortunately, we didn't draw Surgical Extraction until they were already on the field, and that pretty much lost us the game. GG's opponent, nothing I could have done game 1, and with a bit more fortune, maybe we could have taken game 2, but I don't think it was a certainty whatsoever. Our opening hand, whilst being a bit mana floodish, is not that bad. We have an Insolent Nene to get the Urabrask into our graveyard. We have part of the combo in Electrodominance. We just need a Living End, and at least we can bring back the Urabrask and hopefully a few more creatures. It's also worth noting that, judging by the artwork, I'm pretty confident the guy from Electrodominance is a very much evolved species of old orangutan titties over here. Rather predictably, we begin with an Insolent Neonate. We're looking to discard that Urabrask as soon as possible. Our opponent plays a Tron land, and for fuck's sake. Main deck Relic of Progenitus could make our deck look as embarrassing as that time I tried to take up a rapping career. Yeah. Let me tell you a story about some of my friends who always ask me, what's the best way to stay safe on the mean streets? What's the best way to wrap your presents safely? Well, you begin with some bubble wrap. You don't want your package to get damaged. So we pop some bubble wrap around here like this. Not very neat, I know. That's the end of the joke. It's a wrapping joke. It's wrapping a present. Wasn't even a very good rapper, music-wise, either. I don't even have any wrapping paper, I couldn't find any. It's the middle of January. All my family's, birthdays were at the end of last year. Christmas is, 11 months off? This means we're not really going to be able to use our graveyard for a while, and for now we should just look at improving our board state and hoping our opponent doesn't have one of these crazy Tron draws. We get in for a point of damage with the Insolent Neonate. We put down the Blood Crypt, we pay no life, and we pass back to our opponent. They have their second Tron land and a Chromatic Sphere. They decline to crack said sphere, we untap, we find yet another land. Put down a Wooded Foothills, get for a point of damage, and we pass back to our opponent. Not really much going on, but on the plus side, if we're going to be drawing lands, we can cast our Archfiend of Ifnir next turn. Our opponent cracks the Chromatic Sphere and goes for an Ancient Stirrings. We need them to avoid the Urza's Tower. For fuck's sake, 2.0. Luckily at this point, our opponent has one of their lands tapped, so they can't play a big threat. However, a 2-2 Walking Ballista ain't that bad. Our opponent guns down our Vampire like some kind of Blade impression. I decide to go ahead and discard a land because at this point our opponent's lands are tapped, so if we can draw that Living End, we're going to be able to reanimate all of our graveyard. This is our window, and much like having an extremely expensive prostitute, we're going all in. We find a swamp off the top, not the Living End we want. I decide to go ahead and cycle the Archfiend, find another land, and we pretty much have to find a Living End off the top, otherwise we are a bit fucked. I decide to fetch right now, get a mountain within our library of as many lands as we possibly can, and
What is it, Mom? What is it?
we Mausoleum Secret to search up the Living End, we cast said Living End through an Electrodominance, and all of a sudden we have a board. We get back an Archfiend, and, as it turns out quite importantly, we get back our Insolent Neonate. Now you may be asking, why is this Insolent Neonate so damn important? Well, our opponent untaps and they play a Wormcoil Engine. We're going to be able to swing for 5 points of damage in the air with the Archfiend of Ifnir, and then block and sacrifice the Insolent Neonate, so our opponent does not gain any life. And that is exactly what plays out. We get in for 5 points of damage, and we block, sack with the Insolent Neonate. We disperse of our land, and we draw into a Karizev's Expertise. Now, I'm guessing you guys didn't know that Karizev's Expertise isn't just an enabler for Living End, it can also steal an opponent's creature. We can take their Wormcoil Engine and beat them in the face with it. And nobody deserves it more than these dirty Tron players. Our opponent's Sylvan Scryings. They get themselves a Sanctum of Ugin, and they crack an Expedition map. It looks like our opponent's trying to thin their library of as many lands as they possibly can, and then hopefully top deck a win condition next turn. If we top deck a Lightning Bolt off the top, and we steal their Wormcoil Engine, then we are going to have enough damage to kill them exactly next turn. However, failing that, we can still Urabrask, get in and put them down to 3 points of life, and then the Karizev's Expertise will be a good follow-up play. Unfortunately, we top deck the Monkey with a Big Stick. I pop down the Urabrask, we get in at our opponent for a total of 9 damage, leaving them on a precious 3 life. Our opponent gets in for 5 points of damage with the Wormcoil Engine. They gain 5 points of life. However, Karizev's Expertise essentially says, fuck that, I'm going to take your Wormcoil Engine and hit you back for 5. Our opponent needs to have an Ugin or at least an Oblivion Stone to survive this turn. They cast a World Breaker, it will come in tapped anyway thanks to Urabrask. Our opponent finally realises this and concedes the game. In sideboarding, we bring in the Ingot Chewers. Those are going to be very good at taking out Relic of Progenitises and early Expedition maps. We also bring in the Young Pyromancers. We're hoping that we're going to be able to catch our opponent with an aggressive hand and end the game before they can get set up. We take out some Horrors and some Insolent Neonates. We're not looking to be as all in on our graveyard. Our hand in Game 2 has some of the combo. We have just one land, but a Simian Spirit Guide. We find an Ingot Chewer off the top to get rid of our opponent's Expedition map. Not a bad top deck. Hopefully our opponent was all in on the Expedition map to find a second land. Now, I'm not going to do too much in the way of Game 2 here. Our opponent does get themselves down a Khan on turn 4 and follows up with an Oblivion Stone, meaning that pretty much if we Living End, we're only really going to be able to get in for maybe one attack and it won't be enough. So I decide to concede the game and hope for better in Game 3. I keep an opening hand that has plenty of fetch lands, meaning we're going to be able to take a lot of lands out of our library. We also have part of the Living End combo and a Faithless Looting, which is really saving this opening hand. It's pretty terrible otherwise. We fetch with a Bloodstay Mire, we get a Blood Crypt. Our life total doesn't matter against Tron. We cast the Faithless Looting, we draw into another land and another Faithless Looting. Now that's not too bad. We can pitch a couple of lands, we've got plenty of those, and we can just Faithless Looting again next turn. Our opponent plays a tower and then plays an Expedition map. This would be a very good time to top deck Ingot Chewer. We find a Street Wraith, we instantly cycle it, we lose 2 life. We find a Lightning Bolt, cast Faithless Looting, and we find an Electrodominance and another Lightning Bolt. Now this hand has turned out pretty well so far. I decide to pitch a Bloodstained Mire and the Urabrask. As long as our opponent doesn't have Relic of Progenitors this turn, we should be able to Electrodominance and we're going to be in a great position heading into the next couple of turns. Our opponent has a Forest, meaning no turn 3 Tron. That is a great thing for us. We're going to be able to win in a couple of turns. Our opponent casts, yeah. For any of you Tron players out there, don't do this. Grafdigger's Cage does not work against Living End. Living End exiles the creatures from the graveyard, and then they enter the battlefield from exile. Our opponent just paid 1 mana to do nothing. We fetch with the Bloodstained Mire, we get a Blood Crypt, we shock ourselves. I Lightning Bolt our opponent. I think we might be able to kill them in a couple of turns, even through an Oblivion Stone. We top deck a Mountain, not great, but at least we can cast Electrodominance and our Lightning Bolt now. The Living End resolves, we get back a Street Wraith and an Urabrask. We get in for 7 points of damage because that is what Urabrask does for this deck. It gives you that very quick chunk of damage when your opponents aren't expecting it. And with no second Tron land on board, I think it's going to be very, very hard for our opponent to stabilize and not die next turn. They untap, they play themselves a second Tron land. We have Expedition maps so they can have Tron next turn, but we should be able to kill them this turn coming up. We untap, we find a Desert Ceradon. That does nothing. We get in for 7 points of damage. Our opponent is within Lightning Bolt range. I decide to wait until the end step because they could have a Nature's Claim for some reason in their deck, and I want to give them no opportunity to use it. Our opponent does use their Forest to crack Expedition map, and in response I Lightning Bolt, and I forgot about Sphere, which they can crack and float a green mana. Luckily for us, they never had the Nature's Claim anyway, and we win the game and take down Tron. Now, before we move on to the final round, let's take a brief look at what happened against our 4th round opponent who was playing 8 whack goblins. We begin the game with a perfectly reasonable hand. We have some cyclers and not many lands. We just need the win condition in Electrodominance, and we have the Mausoleum Secrets in hand. Our opponent gets off to a good but slow start. There's only a Foundry Street Denizen on turn 1. We find ourselves the Blood Crypt off the top. We find a Lightning Bolt to stall, which is going to help us really not take much damage in the early part of the game. After taking out the Foundry Street Denizen, our opponent's left with just a Goblin Piledriver, which is a scary thought. I'm kind of banking on the fact we're going to be able to board wipe or at the very least hit our land drops. We do end up finding lands off the top, which is perfectly fine with a Simian Spirit Guide that allows us to Archfiend of Ifnir and instantly cycle the Fairy Macabre. Our opponent does manage to get a kicked Goblin Bushwhacker, which means we go down to 7 points of life and it ends up being quite a close game. However, as I've always said, when Archfiend of Ifnir is on the field, he becomes the Pimp Fiend. He's going to bitch slap our opponent's entire team with just the cycle of a Fairy Macabre. The turning point ends up being when our opponent just next turn swings in with a Goblin Piledriver, and we cycle the Fairy Macabre to kill their entire team, and then block the Goblin Piledriver with no danger to our Archfiend of Ifnir. We end up getting in for 5 points of damage here and there, and praying to God we stop fucking top decking lands. until eventually we top deck our second Archfiend of Ifnir, which wipes the board again, and we end up taking the game. I was basically praying to God that our opponent never found a Goblin Grenade plus a Goblin that we couldn't deal with, or 2 Lightning Bolts. Thankfully, the 1 Pimp Fiend of Ifnir got us all the way. Our opponent got off to a very aggressive start and our hand was quite clunky. However, we do have what I consider to be a very good sideboard card in this matchup, being the Young Pyromancer. If they don't have any removal, then young Mr. Pyromancer will do quite a lot. However, the biggest trump card on our side is the fact that MTGO is a fucking awful program, and somehow our opponent managed to Goblin Grenade their own goblins, despite it being a sorcery, and they somehow managed to Goblin Grenade each other. I then got into a brief chat with my opponent, and I agreed that I would be on 4 points of life. If my opponent got me to 10 points of life, I genuinely would have conceded the game. And from there, it genuinely was a bit of a grind. We end up at Mausoleum Secrets to get our living end. We just make a few tokens here and there. Our opponent never really builds up any kind of board. I gradually managed to apply a few tokens to the field which can block very well, until our opponent casts a Mog War Marshal on 6 points of life. At this point, I explained to my opponent that even if I consider myself on 1 point of life, I can literally win the game now by casting Electrodominance and killing the 1 Goblin token. It will generate 2 tokens from the Young Pyromancers, and my opponent has no cards in hand and just 1 blocker. I'm going to go for a more flashy play of Living End for a bit of fun. The whole point of this was to explain to my opponent that even if they somehow get me below 11 now, I'm not going to concede because I can literally win the game right now. I'm doing a more flashy play. We cast Electrodominance, we get Living End resolved. Our Urabrask does give all of our creatures haste, so we take down 8 whack goblins. I have no fucking idea what happened in that game. Really weird. My opponent wouldn't have won the game anyway, thank God. And in the end, it saved any kind of confusion. We begin the first game of this match 5 with a Street Wraith, 2 Electrodominances, so we are Inquisition, Thoughtseize Proof, and a whole bunch of mana. I'm not too sure if this hand is good or not, but I think if you have parts of the combo and the rest of the hand is remotely decent, you should probably keep it. Our opponent plays a tapped Hissing Quagmire on turn 1, and now Hissing Quagmire would usually signify green-black rock. We draw into a Pimp Fiend of Ifnir, pretty much what we want right now. We need creatures plus an actual living end, and cyclers are a good way to start. We play the Blood Crypt tapped, our opponent plays a forest, and man. Now, Scavenging Ooze does pose a problem to living end, and something you have to think about what you're going to do. Do you want to aggressively cycle for that living end now, or do you want to hold up your lands and maybe cast a few creatures in the late game? We draw Faithless Looting off the top. Now, I think we're okay for now. I don't want to grow this Scavenging Ooze any higher than it already is, and we can maybe wait a little while. Our opponent gets in for 2 points of damage, and they follow up with a second Scavenging Ooze. Now, our opponent is tapped out for the turn. I think now is the time to go all in on finding our living end. If we can find the living end, we're probably going to win the game. We fetch for a mountain, we cycle Street Wraith, we lose 2 life. We find a Lightning Bolt. I decide to go ahead and Lightning Bolt one of the Scavenging Oozes because worst case scenario we can Electrodominance the other one next turn using our Simian Spirit Guide, and then we are back to square one. Our opponent has no oozes. We find another Street Wraith off the top, we cycle said Street Wraith. We find another Street Wraith, we cycle said Street Wraith again. We are losing a lot of freaking life, and oh my god, it's a living end. We play our Bloodstained Mire, we fetch a basic mountain. We cycle our Archfiend of Ifnir because luckily for us we have a Simian Spirit Monkey Man with a big stick in our hand. We Electrodominance, we cast our living end. We get back 3 Street Wraiths and an Archfiend of Ifnir to our opponent's 1 Scavenging Ooze. Our opponent taps out the Assassin's Trophy Pimp Fiend of Ifnir. We go and search for a basic land. Not ideal, but I think we're okay with that trade. We get a basic swamp. I probably should have got a mountain here to Lightning Bolt the Scavenging Ooze. But our opponent soon concedes when they realise that 3 Street Wraiths are going to absolutely annihilate them over time. After sideboarding, I decide to bring in the Young Pyromancers. I'm expecting Ley Lines and other kinds of graveyard hate. We take out the Living Ends and a Fairy Macabre. I also take out 1 Electrodominance since we're not on the Living End plan anymore. However, we do keep some Electrodominance in. Worst case scenario, they can become a burn spell. We keep an opening hand that is very land rich, however we do have the Pimp Fiend of Ifnir. Our opponent begins with a Blooming Marsh and does nothing. There is no ley line, so not feeling great about our lack of living ends right now. We put down the Insolent Neonate and we pass back to our opponent. I decide to go ahead and discard the Mausoleum Secret since I think we don't really need that anymore and I'd rather draw another card and find some lands for our Archfiend of Ifnir. Our opponent plays a Darkly Confidant. We top deck a Horror of the Broken Lands. Now, we are hitting these creatures, which is great, but we do actually need to find lands. We fetch for a Blood Crypt, and we Fatal Push the Dark Confidant. We don't want our opponent getting a big card advantage over us. Our opponent plays a Verdant Catacombs, and they put down a Tireless Tracker. Now, I would have probably kept the Fatal Push for the Tireless Tracker if they had that in their deck. The Bob will deal damage over time, and I think we can deal with a Bob much better than a Tireless Tracker. We do top deck the land we really want, so we're going to be able to start casting our creatures in the next few turns. Unfortunately, this Tireless Tracker might get out of hand by then. Our opponent plays a Hissing Quagmire that gets a Clue Token. They cast a second Bob. Hopefully, this Bob is going to make them take loads of damage, and we might be able to catch up in the late game. We fetch for a Blood Crypt, we play it tapped, and our opponent gets in for 3 points of damage. We top deck a Faithless Looting, which is quite nice. I don't really want this Forbidden Orchard in my hand. I discard the Forbidden Orchard and the Cathartic Reunion since we now have all the lands we need, plus some creatures we can actually cast from our hand. Our hand is shaping up quite nicely. It's now just a matter of, are we going to be dead before we get to cast our things? Our opponent casts an Inquisition. That is a no-go, my friend. That will not hit any of our hand. They get a Verdant Catacombs. They get another Clue Token. They fetch. They get another bloody Clue Token. They pump the Tireless Tracker. I think they're trying to get Tireless Tracker bigger than all of our creatures, so we are forced to block. They get in for a total of 7 points of damage, and we are on the back foot big time. We top deck a Street Wraith, which is actually an incredibly good draw because now we can cast our Pimp Fiend and instantly cycle the Street Wraith to at least get rid of the Dark Confidant, and now Archfiend might be able to just trade with the Tireless Tracker rather than chump blocking. Our opponent cracks the clues, and rather surprisingly, they offer us the trade of a Tireless Tracker for the Archfiend of Ifnir. Obviously, we have to take that trade, otherwise we are dead. We top deck a Street Wraith, we play our Horror of the Broken Lands, and our opponent plays a land and a Liliana of the Veil. I concede since they're going to make us sacrifice the Horror of the Broken Lands and then get in for lethal with the Treetop Village. I cycle the Street Wraith first, see if maybe there's something I'm not thinking of, and it was a Bloodstained Mire, so yep, GG. Back to sideboarding, and when we're on the play, I decided to bring back in the Living Ends and the Electrodominance. We didn't see ley lines there. That isn't to say our opponent doesn't have them, but there is a chance they don't have them. However, I really want to keep our Young Pyromancers in because if our opponent does have those ley lines, then we're quite a slow deck as we saw just there. I take out the Tormenting Voice and a Cathartic Reunion, hoping our creature cycling could get us there. And we take out some Anger of the Gods. We begin game 3 with probably the best hand we've seen so far. 2 lands, a Young Pyromancer, and a Faithless Looting to get the Urabrask and the Desert Ceridon into our graveyard. All we need to do is find the Living End. We Faithless Looting, we draw into Fatal Push and another land. We get rid of Urabrask and Desert Ceridon, they are the easiest cards to discard, and we pass back to our opponents. They play a Treetop Village and straight away pass back to us. We untap, we find a mountain off the top. Now, sure, it's great we're finding lands, but we'd also like to find something other than lands so we can find that Living End and win the game. We play a Bloodstained Mire, we fetch for a basic mountain, and we put down the Young Pyromancer. Our opponent untaps, plays a Field of Ruin, and passes back to us again. There is no black mana for them. That is a great sign when we have a Young Pyromancer out. We find a Cathartic Reunion off the top, we fetch with a Bloodstained Mire, and get a basic mountain. We get in for 2 points of damage with Young Pyromancer. I did consider using a Cathartic Reunion here, but I don't really want to get rid of the Karizev's Expertise or the Fatal Push in my hand, so I'm going to wait until next turn. Our opponent plays a Forest, and Field of Ruins our Blood Crypt, presumably to get a Swamp. They cast a Thoughtseize, and they take our Enabler, the Karizev's Expertise, be gone. We top deck a Mausoleum Secrets, which is really annoying because we would have been able to go off this turn if our opponent didn't have exactly Thoughtseize. With Cathartic Reunion, I pitch the Fatal Push now because now that we have the Mausoleum Secrets, I really do want to find that last piece we need to get our graveyard back onto the battlefield. Unfortunately, we find a Wheel of Fate and another Mausoleum Secret, so we have all of the win conditions, but no Enabler. We get a token from the Young Pyromancer, we suspend Wheel of Fate. We get in for a cheeky 2 points of damage and pass back to our opponent, who unfortunately has a bloody Scavenging Ooze. Luckily, our Mausoleum Secrets will be able to get the second Fatal Push, and we should be able to get rid of that thing pretty soon, whilst also getting 2 Elemental tokens. We untap, and rather luckily we find the Fatal Push off the top. Our opponent surgically extracts the Faithless Looting. Why? Sure. They take all of the Faithless Lootings out of our deck, we Kung Fu kick the Scavenger Goose off a cliff, and get in for 3 points of damage. Our opponent untaps and they play a Kalitas. What the fuck do we do about that? We find another Young Pyromancer off the top, which is still pretty good. We might be able to still win this game by going around the Kalitas if we can assemble enough tokens. Our opponent gets in for 3 points of damage. We are happy to take it. We're going to be doing more damage back to them than that next turn. They then play a second Kalitas. I don't really know why. That just seems like a bad idea. I decide to go ahead and cast Mausoleum Secrets on end step, so at least we can find the Living End out of our library, so if we do top deck an Enabler, we can cast it straight away. We get 2 Elemental tokens, we untap and we find a Wheel of Fate, which is pretty annoying. We're finding all of the actual win conditions, but no Enablers for them. I suspend the second Wheel of Fate. I think we're going to have enough time to get both Wheel of Fates at this current rate. We're kind of in a board stall. Our opponent plays a Fulminator Mage, which is basically bad right now. Do you get it? Because of basic land. I cast the Mausoleum Secrets on end step, but I don't search up the Living End. I just want to use that to create 2 more tokens, since we're going to have to discard our hand next turn anyway. The Wheel of Fate comes off suspend. We both draw 7 cards, and our opponent has to discard 1 card. We get another 2 Elemental tokens. In response, our opponent surgically extracts the Fatal Push in our graveyard, which is the last Fatal Push. There are no Fatal Pushes in our library. Our Wheel of Fate reveals a plethora of goodies. We find an Electrodominance plus a Karizev's Expertise, and I think with quick calculations that might win us the game. We take control of the Kalitas. Again, people seem to forget that Karizev's Expertise does have a second mode. It doesn't just say cast a Living End. We take control of Kalitas, we get in with the team. In response, our opponent animates the Treetop Village, and they block both Young Pyromancers, meaning we put them down to just 3 life. With 2 Electrodominances in our hand, we might be able to burn them out, even though we haven't actually cast a Living End in the last 2 games. We cycle a Street Wraith, looking for a Lightning Bolt right now. We don't find it. We pass the turn back to our opponent, and they get back of Kalitas. We're hoping they're not going to gain too much life this turn. They put down a Tarmogoyf and put down a Dark Confidant. Now that is very brave indeed. And without having to attack, we just Electrodominates for a total of 5 mana for 3 damage. The worst Lightning Bolt I've ever played. So all in all, with Mono Red Living End, we ended up 4-1, and the one matchup we lost was to Liliana's Caress, a card that pretty much hard counters our deck, and there's not really much we could have done about it. Electrodominance was definitely an upgrade to this deck. It offers more than just an instant speed Living End. It offers removal and actual burn to the face, as we saw in the last 2 games. I don't know what changes I would make to the main. I think that is about where the deck needs to be. But I think in the sideboard there are definitely changes we could have made. I think I would like to put more cards in to transform into a more aggro deck like I did with the previous Mono Red Living End. I think some Goblin Bushwhackers, maybe some more burn spells would have gone down very, very well in the sideboard. We probably could have chopped the Guttural Responses to get that kind of effect. Overall, I wouldn't put people off playing Mono Red Living End or even this Rakdos version of it, but in reality it probably does need the splash of blue for As Foretold, and it did feel like sometimes we were getting a bit fortunate with top decks during the games, although you do have top decks for a reason. One thing's for certain though, Electrodominance has made non-Cascade Living Ends a very, very good deck.